Hi, everybody. Happy spring, happy bird month, happy sunny days. We've had weird weather for the last little while, so it's nice to hear the birds singing in the backyard. Julia Rankin is here with us today. Julia, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to talk to you. Reading your book in the month of May was a joy, an absolute joy, and I'm excited to get to hearing your reading and talking to you about field notes. Before we get started, with Julia's permission, and before I share our acknowledgement of land, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the 215 children who were killed by the administration or staff at the Kamloops Residential School. Their bodies were found this past week. While many shared their shock at this tragic discovery, I believe we need to move beyond the shock and apology loop the government seems stuck in. The ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada demands further inquiry and accountability. Over 5,300 staff who worked at the schools have been located by the government, yet fewer than 50 have faced criminal charges. I'd like to ask you today to take some time to read the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Kaylee is going to share the links. Perhaps send a letter to your MP and demand more action and accountability. Words and reports seem to do very little but spark these public performances of shock, including all of the empty apologies. I would like to acknowledge that I am sitting in Tekaronto, as is Julia. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on their territory. As some of you are in territory or maybe in territory outside of Tekaronto, I invite you to offer your own personal acknowledgement. Julia, thank you so much for allowing me to share that. I don't generally like to get political, but it's been quite a week, and I really appreciate you allowing us to take a moment to have that little tiny conversation. I am excited to hear, as I am every time I welcome a new author. I'm excited to hear what you're reading, and I'm hoping you'll share with everybody what you're reading at the moment.
So I just finished an absolutely wonderful book by Elizabeth McCracken. She is an amazing American short story writer and novelist, and her latest book is called The Souvenir Museum, and it's a book of short stories, and it is absolutely fantastic. It is hilarious.
Right.
And also, but it's not just, haha, funny. It really gets into our quirks and our foibles and what makes us human. And her characters are so three-dimensional, and nobody's good and nobody's bad, and everyone's really weird. And it is just such a fantastic read. So I heartily recommend that. The Souvenir Museum.
Oh, that's awesome. Kaylee's going to share the link for everybody if you're interested in finding it somewhere. Thank you. With your permission, if I could read your biography before you share a reading with us.
Of course.
Julia Zarankin is a writer, birder, occasional bird splainer, lecturer, and culture tour leader based in Toronto. Her writing has appeared in Audubon, Canadian Geographic, The Walrus, Hazlitt, The Letters Page, Cottage Life, Orion Magazine, Three Penny Review, Prism International, Antioch Review, Birding Magazine, Maisonneuve, The New Quarterly, Ontario Nature, and the Globe and Mail. She was shortlisted for the CBC Short Story Prize in 2020. She won the Eden Mills Writers Festival Nonfiction Prize and has been first runner-up for the Prism International Nonfiction Prize, a finalist for the TNQ Edna Stabler Personal Essay Contest, and twice longlisted for the CBC Nonfiction Prize. Julia, that's incredible. Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear you read. As I said to you before, reading this book was pure joy, and I'm excited to for you to share your words with everybody.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Allison. I am so happy to be here with all of you this afternoon. I dressed for the occasion. Hold on, let me show you my shirt. Um, so here I am. I'm going to talk to you about my book. I'm going to read to you from my book, and it is just so fantastic to be here. And thank you, all of you, for your attention and for spending this glorious sunny Sunday with me and with my words. There's really nothing, I'm so honored by all the readers who have engaged with my book and by all of you listeners. This is really such an enormous joy for me as a writer. So I'm going to start off by reading a little bit from my book, Field Notes from an Unintentional Birder. And I'm going to start close to the beginning. So it's a chapter called Spark Bird, which is the term that people in the bird world refer to the first bird that you see that really makes you fall in love with birds. So my spark bird was the red-winged blackbird, which is a really common springtime migrant here in southern Ontario. But it was really the first bird that I had ever seen in my life. So I'm gonna read you from this chapter. And the title of my book, Field Notes from an Unintentional Birder, I absolutely mean that. I do not come from a nature loving family. My parents are classical pianists. I grew up visiting concert halls, museums, libraries. We didn't do nature. So the fact that I fell in love with birds and then documented that through this memoir was really a shock to my entire family and to my husband and to me as well. So it really was this unintentional midlife love affair, really, that continues to this day. So I'm going to read to you from the chapter called Spark Bird. I had no trouble recognizing the group in the parking lot. Cargo pants tucked into socks and signature off-white multi-pocketed vests, which I recognized from the times I had Googled bird watchers. Each of the half dozen people huddled around their cars wore at least one item of bird-themed clothing, ranging from the subtle baseball cap with a woodpecker on it to a more boisterous sweatshirt featuring a giant red bird with black wings, so bright I wondered for a minute if the bird could be real. I looked around for the leader while I tried to make sense of their optics talk. Questions of magnification and optical quality of vortex versus eagle eye passed me by completely, but I understood enough to nod in appreciation when Lucy, a petite, retired high school teacher, showed off her recently purchased high-end Swarovski binoculars. She later admitted with a mischievous smile that she had bought them with money that she'd set aside for a sofa. I knew the leader had arrived once a rusty Toyota pulled up and everyone said, "There's Brett." A 6-foot-tall high school math and science teacher, Brett wore sweatpants with a Norwegian knit sweater and a baseball cap with yet another bird on it. Initially stern, his face lit up when he said, "I read a pretty good trip report this morning. Let's head straight to Kipling Spit." Though the references to a report and Kipling Spit were both lost on me, I introduced myself, reminded him of the email I had sent a few days earlier, and sheepishly admitted that I was a complete beginner. Not to worry, folks in our group have varying degrees of experience. I mean, there isn't a single person in the group who can ID all the warblers. A warbler? I asked. I knew ducks and pigeons and owls existed, but what were warblers? Wow, you weren't kidding when you said beginner, he said. Nope. Do you have binoculars? I shook my head. That might be a good place to start, said Brett with a chuckle, which I thought might be code for, who is this interloper? How did she find me on the internet? And why on earth did I email her back when she clearly said she did not know a thing about birds? Once we got into our respective cars, our cavalcade of birders thundered down the highway until we reached a park at the foot of Kipling Avenue, where the city meets Lake Ontario, and where, according to the report Brett had read on Aunt Birds, a Western grebe had recently been seen. A kind gentleman named Benito, draped in a long-lensed camera and binoculars, and with a spotting scope casually resting on his shoulder, let me borrow his spare binoculars, which he alternately called his bins, or binocs, or glasses. The binoculars were heavy around the neck. As we walked out to the lake, people started shouting words that I couldn't process. Northern shoveler, red-breasted merganser, American widgeon, bufflehead, long-tailed duck. The binoculars wobbled in my hands. High winds accosted me, and when I tried to focus the lenses, my eyes watered. The second I glimpsed a duck, it dove and left me staring at the hyperactive early April waves on Lake Ontario. Wait, look, Brett shouted. I think I got it. Horn grebe over there, next to the pie-billed grebe. You can't miss it. To the right of the dozens, no, hundreds of redneck grebes out there. Oh my God, is that a Western grebe? Are you seeing the grebes, Julia? It's not every day you get 4 species in one place. My mind bobbed in and out of awareness amidst this sea of names. I nodded, but my binoculars were pointed at the CN Tower, the only thing I could safely identify on the horizon. What's a grebe? I asked. Start with the redneck grebes. There are close to 500 of them out there, Brett replied. You can't miss them. Gorgeous rust-colored neck. And look at that elongated bill. It's a textbook grebe, no doubt about it. I located the mass of waterfowl, but in the dull light, I couldn't detect anything remotely rust-colored, and all the bills looked identical to my untrained eye. On our way back to the cars, my extremities frozen from standing still in gale-like winds, I wondered how many more hours of staring at dark blobs on the water I could withstand. Disenchanted, I was preparing my exit speech to the group when we stopped near a bush and somebody called out, "Red-winged blackbird." I almost didn't look because the thought of lifting the binoculars to my eyes brought with it a slight wave of nausea. But the bird stood still, balancing on a cattail, and I managed the trifecta of raising the binoculars, focusing them, and finding the desired object magnified in my field of vision. What is that? I gasped, nearly blinded by the unexpected vermilion patches on the blackbird's epaulets. I watched as the bird threw back its head, opened wide its beak, and let out a sound so primal it left me marveling. This was as close as I would ever stand to dinosaurs. If this bird had been there all along, I thought, what else had I been missing? So that was really the encounter that changed everything for me. Finding this red-winged blackbird for the first time, meeting this bird group for the first time, and having my world just completely cracked open. I saw that bird and I wondered, oh my God, what else had I been missing? And as I mentioned, my love affair with birds and with nature actually was a complete shock for my family, and especially for my grandmother. I'm very, very close to my grandmother, and she figures quite prominently in this book as well. So I'm gonna read to you from another chapter in this book where I have a discussion with my grandmother about this newfound interest, passion / obsession of mine. And my grandparents. So I'm an immigrant from the Soviet Union, and we emigrated to Canada in the late 70s. But my grandmother and my great-grandmother, my grandfather died in the Soviet Union. Anyway, my grandma and great-grandma came to Canada 9 years later. So during those 9 years, they would send us parcels full of books. And so you just need that as background information.
Yeah.
In one of these parcels was a flimsy paperback called Birds of Our Forest that my grandmother must have sent in the early 1980s, and which I must have flipped through or not before setting it aside on my bookshelf. I rediscovered the book a few years ago when my parents embarked on an extensive home renovation. They tasked me with packing up my old bedroom, which still housed all of my Soviet picture books. I reread the usual suspects, fairy tales with folksy illustrations, didactic verse with the requisite dreams of incessant hard work for the industrial homeland, including a peculiar story of a young woman whose mother proudly worked as a senior milkmaid on the collective farm. This all seemed in keeping with my grandmother's unquestioning acceptance of Soviet ideology. Ever a perfectionist and a model student, she only began to question her world after emigration, and even then, reluctantly. But the book about nature surprised me. The primitively illustrated children's book urged the younger generation to explore the great forests of the Soviet Union. There were woodpeckers, ravens, wood grouse, titmice, little owls, woodcocks, kingfishers, hawks, words that would have meant nothing to me as a child. It was a book I don't remember thanking her for. Maybe it was dwarfed by the bottles of Red Moscow perfume that she had sent, whose scent I tried to inhale in hopes of recognizing my grandmother. When she arrived in Canada in 1987, her fur coat reeked of mothballs, and it turned out she reserved dabbing Red Moscow behind the ears for special occasions. Between the fur, the arresting bleached blonde hair, the Eastern Bloc woolens, and the clothes packed in thick plastic bags that had been washed and air dried, there was little I recognized of the person to whom I had written so many letters. Why my grandmother, who believed in the higher gods of symphony halls and ballet performances, and who had no interest in the natural world, chose to send me a book about Russian birds remains a mystery to me. Her experience with the Soviet natural world was limited to forced summers on the collective farm, the kolkhoz, where she picked cotton or sugar beets for days on end. That was enough nature for a lifetime, she told me. Why did you buy me this book? I asked. For a moment, I imagined that my grandmother had been the accidental culprit, that the cheap Soviet paperback had been the driving force behind my transformation from nature novice into bona fide bird nerd, and that my interest in the avian world wasn't so much a genealogical anomaly as historically determined. I bought you dozens of books. At one point, I just bought all the new children's books I could find, even translations, she said. But did you imagine I'd become interested in birds? You know, I don't think I even read the titles, my grandmother said. She refuses to have any involvement in my new bird life. To her, it makes little sense. Normal people go to the opera, she tells me, but you now go to bed at 9 o'clock and set your alarm clock for 4 in the morning, and you look at birds. My decision to choose the outdoors baffled my grandmother. Hadn't her ancestors, the Lupalover-Lupolyansky clan, had their fill of the dirty outdoors in their shtetls in the Pale of Settlement, where Jews had been forced to live since the time of Catherine the Great? Wouldn't they have run towards civilization and chosen institutions of higher learning and the glamour of opera houses and concert halls if only it had been accessible to them? I didn't realize I was disappointing an entire lineage. The outdoors were for other people. I still think you must have known, I say to her. I wanted you to speak Russian and love literature, so I sent you poetry by Agnia Barto and Sergei Mikhalkov. I also wanted you to become a scientist, and so I sent you my favorite primer about microbes, she said. Poems about disciplined children of good, strong Soviet workers, biology for beginners. All those books still lay on my shelf untouched. Well, the birds are your fault, I teased her. Your grandfather always said that the books were useless. Who will read them, he asked me, when I forced him to carry boxes to the post office. I told him that maybe you would become a scientist. Well, bird watching is related to science, I said. The wrong kind of science. She looks at me, her eyes resting on the tip of her nose. I had dashed her dreams of a granddaughter MD who would help fight cancer and instead replaced them with a granddaughter who went out at dawn every Saturday morning with a pair of binoculars and watched birds. Do you at least take photographs? She asked. No, good camera equipment is too heavy. So what, you just look? Well, it's not just looking. I study the birds. I observe them carefully. And sometimes I write a blog post about what I see. But yeah, basically, I just look. Do people pay you for your blog posts? I laughed. Not only is it the wrong kind of science, but it also fails in the realm of practicality. Yet another letdown she has had to endure in old age. So wait, she said, you wake up early just to look? At least with hunters, I understand. They have something to bring home, but looking? So yeah, my family was quite shocked at this newfound interest of mine. And another thing you should know about this book is that this book is not ornithology. I am not a scientist. I am very much a writer, fascinated by things I don't understand. And initially when I started birding, it was such a foreign universe to me. In fact, it was like learning a new language, right? I had to understand what wing tips were, wing bars, all this birdie lingo was completely new for me. So this book really documents my fascination with engaging in this new world. And it's also a book about how through birding, I fall in love with Toronto in a completely different way and learn to see the city through a new lens. So the book kind of tells many stories at the same time. And it's also about finding love and finding a home, which all happened through birding. And people often ask me, what's your favorite bird? So I have a chapter called What's Your Favorite Bird? And I'm just going to read about a little bit more about my very favorite bird called the American woodcock. If I could get a bird inked on my body, it would be the American woodcock, the largest North American shorebird, which hangs out mostly on damp ground in the woods, perfectly camouflaged with its surroundings. To me, the bird looks like an accident of nature, its eyes grotesquely close together, perched high up on its head, giving it almost 360 degrees of vision for detecting predators, and a long, ultra-sensitive bill for probing the ground for worms that it cannot see. Stocky, short-legged, incessantly pouting, this is a bird with attitude. And yet the American woodcock is also one of the more curious Don Juans of the avian world. In early spring at dusk, the bird engages in an aerial mating dance that counts among the most peculiar things I have ever seen. The aerial display of the woodcock is so odd that many birding clubs host outings just to bear witness to the bird's eccentric pre-mating performance. It begins with a nasal peent, repeated more times than strictly necessary. And if a nasal note weren't enough to get a girl going, what follows is nothing short of spectacular. The pouty, stocky woodcock hurls himself high into the ether on whistling wings, ascending in a series of wide circles, as if he had suddenly developed the agility of a nymph. And then he plummets to the ground with a yelp and does the acrobatic feat all over again. These peents and aerial dances work like a charm in the spring. The American woodcock mates morning and night without fail for 8 straight weeks. What female wouldn't be seduced by such a show? After witnessing the stocky bird's transformation into an aerial gymnast, even I could be convinced to mate with a woodcock. So I'm going to end my reading there. And I guess Allison and I are going to talk about the book a little bit, and then we welcome questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you so much. So enjoyable. So enjoyable to hear you read it, to get the intonations of your voice on top of the voice in the book is great. Um, so I knew that I wasn't going to be able to open up by asking you your favorite bird. It is prohibited, at least it sounds like, after reading the book. But I do want to ask you, and if you want to talk more about what a nemesis bird is, I do want to ask you if your nemesis bird is still the Bohemian waxwing.
Um, thank you for that question. Yes, well, the tragic thing about this winter is that I did not get to see a Bohemian waxwing, so that remains one of my nemesis birds. A nemesis bird is basically a bird that you desperately want to see, and it keeps eluding you for whatever reason. I mean, birds do fly after all. They're tricky that way. So but for the longest time, my nemesis bird used to be a pileated woodpecker. And then one day I saw a pileated woodpecker, and I write about this in the book. And it was this moment of total ecstasy. My friends and I were like, oh my God, we were in raptures. And then suddenly I went from being so happy to so devastated, because I was like, oh my God, what does one do when one sees one's nemesis? Like, what now?
Yeah.
And so, I now have a whole list of nemesis birds. So
Right.
once I see the Bohemian waxwing, it's okay. I have about 20 more that I want to see immediately
Well,
after.
I was gonna say, as reading it, I'm sorry, I have some kind of weird hair that keeps flying somewhere. I've tried to get rid of it, but as I was reading through it, I thought exactly that your nemesis list could be endless, potentially, the more you know, right? The more you learn and the more you know.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's the thing about birding as well. First of all, there are 10,000 species in the world. And another thing about watching birds is the more you see, the more you want to see. And the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, like how much you don't know. So yeah, the nemesis list keeps growing. And there's a line in my book where I say, the saddest thing in the world is not to have a nemesis bird. Because that means like you've done it all, right?
Right. Yeah, like that character from the States. I can't remember his name, but the one who won the um marathon, the marathon event. Can't remember the name of it, but I won't tell
But
everyone.
actually, sorry, just one other thing I wanted to say. One of the biggest surprises for me about birding and also about writing this book is initially I thought, okay, well, this is a hobby I'll do for a year. I'll watch spring migration, the big spectacle, and I'll be done with it. But no, that's not what happens because you
No.
want more.
Yeah. We just moved to Lakeshore and Kipling. So we are literally, that's our walk to the point. You called it Kipling's Point.
Amazing.
That's
Yeah.
our regular walk. So I'm very familiar. We saw a white snowy owl this past winter, which was quite exciting. But then it was immediately there were like probably 20 people there with cameras and stuff taking pictures, and we didn't have a camera, we didn't have anything exciting, so we left.
Yeah. Celebrity birds.
Yeah, that's right. So I want to talk about the narrative. You talked about your grandmother, so and I do want to talk about the other characters and the potential that I found in their potential development. But the narrative, I was jarred, but in a really good way, with how the narrative kind of flits back and forth between the past and present, and you enter, exit, and re-enter time periods seemingly at will. Like there's no chronology to the book, and I loved that because I really felt that there was a strong connection between the narrative and the subject matter. So I want to talk about whether that was something you actively thought about, or if it was happenstance, like it just naturally happened as a result of your experience as a birder becoming a birder and writing, blogs and nonfiction essays and so on and so forth, if that's.
Yeah, no, that's such an interesting question. Well, I mentioned that of course I'm not a scientist, and in a way in this book I commit the cardinal sin of science is that I anthropomorphize, right? I almost treat the birds as people, and I think part of the reason, how do I say this? Part of the reason for that is the more I got to know birds, or my entryway into birds was really seeing my life reflected in theirs. And this is something a scientist should never do, but as a writer, that's immediately where my mind went. And the more I got to know birds, the more I started seeing similarities between my life narrative and theirs. And especially when I started volunteering at a migration monitoring station, which is basically a bird banding station, right? And the more I started learning about bird migration, the more I started thinking back to my family's migratory stories, right, from the Soviet Union to Canada. But even before we left the Soviet Union, my family migrated all over the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, like during World War II. So it almost felt like the migratory impulse was in my DNA as well. And I think that accounts for a lot of the narrative shifts, because I was looking for entry points into understanding how birds are and why they are that way, and the natural connection was with my own life. And there's a chapter in here about how, and this was actually the impetus for writing the book. There's a chapter in here about how my bird group, we chased a spotted towhee, which is a bird that does not belong in Ontario. It's a bird that belongs on the West Coast, and by some fluke accident, this bird flew into Southern Ontario. So we hopped in our cars in mid-January and braved the ice and got the bird. And as I was watching the spotted towhee, I started to wonder, like, wow, this guy's really displaced. I wonder what it feels like to feel snow for the first time. And that reminded me of a time when I felt fundamentally displaced when I lived in mid-Missouri for 3 years, teaching Russian literature at the university there. And everybody asked me on a daily basis, like, where are you from? You're not from here. You don't look like us. You don't talk like us. You don't go to church with us. Where are you from? And I wondered if the spotted towhee felt the same thing, which is ridiculous because it's a bird. But that experience of sort of like seeing that discomfort and recognizing that, and I wanted to tell the bird, like, I've been there. I know what you're feeling. And I remember writing a blog post about that. I used to have a blog called Birds and Words, and I wrote a blog post about that. And that was the moment where I realized, like, okay, I have to stop writing a blog because I actually want to write a book. Like, this is more than just these little jokey blog posts about misidentification. And that was kind of the big turning point for me. So that's sort of a roundabout way of answering the question of narrative, but I think it was because I started to see my life reflected in the birds. And so connecting with a bird made me think about my own life experiences, both about like immigration stories, and also like finding love, and sort of learning to be more present in my own life and my home and everything. So that's kind of how it came about.
I love that. I was actually hoping that that was your answer, that it was more of just a natural one thing setting off another, because that feels even more connected to birding and their kind of life patterns and movements. So that's great. That's good. I love in the book the drummer Danny Miles from July Talk, which is one of our family's favorite bands. I love that he's a birder, and this wasn't the only time in the book that I ended up doing a deep dive in Google and trying not just to find out more about why Danny Miles became a birder or how he became a birder, but and I guess maybe it's because we live here, maybe it's because my in-laws were avid birders, but I wonder, in writing it, and every time I had to stop and close and do my deep dive, I wonder if you imagined that this book might be the spark, not the bird spark, but a literary spark for other birders or people wanting to learn more, not necessarily going as far as you did.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, that, that's incredible that it did feel like that spark for you. I have had a lot of people email me and, say that, wow, I had no interest in birds before this, and now I'm looking up for the first time. Um, Also, I feel like with the pandemic, there are more and more people spending time outside in nature and looking around and
Yeah.
looking up. So in a very, very unexpected turn of events, this book was actually published at my time. I was so nervous about it coming out during the pandemic, but it ended up being perfect.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's really my dream, that somebody would read this book and it would inspire them to pay a little bit more attention to what's going on around them. And also, I don't know, also inspire them to maybe try something new, or to understand that, like, yeah, you can have these hobbies in midlife that don't turn into professional careers or whatever, but
Yeah.
you can do something just for the fun of doing
Yes.
it.
Yeah. No, and I loved learning. I mean, this again is just a personal note. I loved learning that April and May are the special times, especially where we are,
Yeah.
because we're very respectful. We go down there with the dogs. We don't take them off leash, but we are quite often, kind of pushed back when birders will, look at us and go, do this or go around this way, and then we're just like, oh crap, and then we got to take the dogs and we go around the other way, or we turn around and take a different path. So it was actually good. I loved reading. I thought, okay, so April and May, we'll just go in the other direction, maybe stay
Yeah.
stay on the street. So
Yeah, April and May are very emotional months for birders. Also because, well, here in Southern Ontario, migration is really concentrated into 3 or 4 weeks. That's
yes.
it. Like,
Yeah.
that's it. And you
Yeah.
got to see it all. No, I mean, you don't. You don't have to go as crazy as, well, as me. But yeah, it that was another huge surprise about birding, just how emotional this enterprise becomes. And I wanted to capture some of that in the book as well. But
Yeah, I wish I could remember a few years ago, there was a bird from South America that happened to land at the Kipling Spit, and it was a huge thing. I don't remember the name of the bird. I just remember that there were a couple of days where people were just fascinated by them on this section of rocks. But anyway, it's a
yeah, well, last week at Kipling Spit, total madness because a yellow-crowned night heron arrived, and that has never come to Toronto. We had a yellow-crowned night heron 7 years ago, but it was not in adult plumage, and suddenly, woo!
right.
Yeah, good thing the bylaw officers didn't come by, because things were a little out of control.
Great. Well, we have a few questions, but I hope that I have enough time, Kaylee, to ask one more. We've had quite a few memoirs just in the spring season of Junction Reads, and I have been so moved reading them, as just as a writer, not necessarily as a reader, thinking about the stories that end up coming up within the stories, in particular your grandmother and the scene with your grandfather chasing the train. Like I honestly, I feel like I could cry now just thinking about it. Um, that's the story, your grandparents' story seems to me so full of potential. And I've thought about this with all of the memoirs. And I want to ask you if in writing your memoir, did were you triggered by writing another story? And not that Bronwyn or Lucy, the two characters in the story that also got me a little choked up, but there's so many moments in this memoir that are rich with loss and tragedy and the potential of another story. Have you thought, or did you think in writing this that something more could come,
Oh, that's such a
either
great.
like fiction or a telling of your grandparents?
That's such a wonderful story, and sorry, a wonderful question. I think about my grandparents' story all the time, and I have written about them in other nonfiction essays that I've published, and now I'm working on a novel, and even though it's fiction, I feel like my grandparents' story informs so much of it, and I'm so fascinated by, my grandmother in particular. She emigrated to Canada in her mid 50s, which mid 50s isn't that old, but that was the end of her life in a way. Like, she did not resume a career in Canada. And I'm so fascinated by these lost lives that we don't talk about, because these people lived for their children, right? Like, her goal became to raise me and my sister and to make sure that we had wonderful lives. And I'm fascinated by lost lives. So I'm exploring that right now through fiction, because I also feel like, there's only so much I could write about my grandparents in nonfiction, because there's just certain stories that are theirs and aren't really mine to tell. But in a fictional realm, I find that much more freeing. So yes, they do continue to inspire me, and that's one of the big things I'm exploring. But lost lives and lost landscapes are basically where I'm at.
I love that. I'm so excited to hear that you're writing fiction. That eliminates my last question of the thing. But I also love, and I guess it's so easy for you because you come from a family of musicians, but I love that your parents had 3 pianos. And for me, the big question when my kids were little was, do we have room for a keyboard? Like, is there room in this house for a keyboard? I don't know. And that your parents had 3 pianos, I thought was just marvelous. And again, maybe not so special or spectacular for you coming from a family of musicians, but if I read a short story with a family like that played equally those 3 pianos, it would just be amazing. So I mean, I could go on talking forever, but I won't, because I know that people are here and they have questions. Kaylee, do you want to take over? Yay.
Yeah, so we have a question from Marilyn. And Marilyn first wanted to know, do you do any birding walks in or around Toronto?
Oh, that's such a great question, Marilyn. I haven't, I take my friends out for birding walks, and it's actually horrible because sometimes we don't see anything. So I get very, very stressed out, because I feel like if I take somebody out for a walk, we have to see like the best birds ever. And sometimes it's really lame. And then I feel really guilty and horrible. But I've been talking with Diaspora Dialogues, and hopefully I'll be able to do a literary walk for them. I did a virtual literary bird walk with them last summer, but we're in conversation about this summer, and depending on COVID rules, hopefully that will come to fruition. But no, I've never formally done a bird walk because I'm too stressed about it. About not seeing the perfect. I haven't quite arrived at the stage of Zen birder, even though I claim to in my book. I'm still very much a work in progress.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine. What's the word that you used for the? I don't want to flippantly use the word manic, but the birders who are constantly. You used a word in the book.
Twitchers.
Twitcher.
Yeah, yes. That's like a term that originated in the UK. Like you read about a bird on a listserv, you hop in your car, and you get it.
And driving 3 hours to.
Yeah, so I do Twitch, on occasion. I would say every 2-3 months, the urge hits me.
Yeah, I would be a Twitcher. I would 100% be a Twitcher. There's no doubt about it. If I dove into birding, I would be driving 500 kilometers to go see a bird. Sorry, Kaylee.
Marilyn also asks, you stated that your family are not birders. Have you succeeded in converting your husband to birding?
Thank you, Marilyn, for that question. That was the big silver lining of the pandemic. Guess what? There was nothing else to do for Leon but bird. Yeah, he's gotten really into it. And I'm a fairly petite person. My husband is a big weight lifter, power lifter guy. I write about this in the book. He's 6 feet tall. He's a big guy. And there was this whole discussion, should I buy a scope? Should I not buy a scope? And he was like, if you buy a scope, you got to carry your own scope. Well, the happy ending is that we bought a scope and he carries it for me. So basically, I'm now living the dream.
Right.
Yeah, I've converted my husband. Well, I mean, sort of more or less, but not the rest of my family. But that my parents are really wonderful about phoning me every time they see a rare bird in their backyard. And 99% of the time, it's a robin.
Right. Yeah, I not that anyone else is interested in this, but we had what Julia thinks is a rose-breasted grosbeak in our backyard. I voice memoed the bird singing in the backyard because I couldn't figure out what it was. And Julia thinks that it's also a rose-breasted grosbeak. So I'm excited. Kaylee, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, we have 2 more questions. The next one is there a second book in the offering, Birding in Russia, perhaps?
Oh, that would be very exciting. So like as I mentioned, I'm working on a novel, but I've been doing a lot of journalism work about birds, and sort of my journalism is becoming a little bit more political. I wrote the cover story for Ontario Nature a couple months ago about the importance of creating greater access to the outdoors for racialized communities and people with disabilities. So I'm kind of using my voice as a writer to shed light on areas of potential improvement in the bird world and in nature communities to make things more accessible, and also using my writerly voice to sort of shed light on conservation issues, which I think are extremely, extremely important.
Yes.
To be written about, not just in a gloom and doom kind of way, but also in a positive way of like, what can we do, where can we help, and what's being done, and what are the exciting things that are happening and happening well today, because I think a lot of exciting things are happening.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I think kids would be more interested. I think my son was more interested when I started talking to him about in his environmental science class that he's taking right now. When I started talking about the impact of climate change on animals, he seemed to be more interested. So I love that idea. I think that would work for young people.
All right, sorry, two more questions. I miscounted the first time. So the next question is from Samantha, and Samantha asks, what was the most surprising thing about the experience of writing a memoir?
Oh, thanks so much for that question, Samantha. Gosh, I think the most surprising thing as I was writing was all of the memories that I was unearthing through the birds. Because I guess when I initially started writing about birds, I was just writing about like what I was seeing. Oh, there's this cool bird. Oh, I messed up. I misidentified. Like I called it killdeer or deer kill, right? It was all of those things. And slowly, the more I got to know the birds, the more I started remembering like little details about my childhood or my life. Or, when I started learning bird song, I'm horrible at birdsong, even though I am the daughter of classical musicians who have extraordinary pitch. I have no pitch. I was born with no pitch. Anyway, suddenly learning birdsong and like coming into contact with these mnemonics, it just brought me straight back to taking Royal Conservatory of Music exams and failing the ear training section. And this being like the bane of my existence and having to go to solfege classes. And I had totally forgotten about that. So I think the biggest surprise of writing this memoir was really just like unearthing these details from my life that both made me smile and cringe at the same time.
Yeah. That's awesome. One more question.
Yeah, our last question today comes from Jared. And Jared says, in your first excerpt, you used a lot of language to describe your birding experience using what seemed to be a lot of reverential, almost ecclesiastical language. Maybe that was unintentional, but I wonder how birds have influenced your worldview, politics, etc.
Thank you so much for that question, Jared. No, I think that that's such a wonderful thing that you pointed out. Like, yes, the language is almost ecclesiastical. For me, birding is a spiritual practice. And I think I didn't write about this so much in the book, but I think when I found birds, I was going through a bit of a midlife crisis. I was in my mid-30s. I was between careers, and I was also sort of like looking for God. I tried a few synagogues that didn't really do it for me, and then I found birds, and other birders will write about this. There's a famous naturalist in the United States who said that birding that's his experience of going to church. It is going outside and looking up, and because the wonderful thing about birds and the natural world in general is that they don't care about you. It forces you to go outside of yourself and outside your head, which I think is so important. So there's a very strong spiritual component to it for me, and it has influenced, I guess, like, what I was saying about the journalism work I'm doing right now. It has made me a little bit more political, certainly in the realm of conservation and the importance of really paying attention to the world we live in and the health of the world we live in. So I'm certainly, when I vote, that is something that I care deeply about. Like, what are these politicians? How are they responding to the climate, to what's happening? So it has changed my worldview completely. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. And I that is something that I write about in the book, about how my world has just become so much larger, thanks to birds and to writing about them.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned you've got these birding best friends, and that they've become family. I love that. That in and of itself expands your worldview, because politically it's almost impossible for you to join a group of strangers and not have your perspective opened up. So
Yeah.
that's great. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm gonna raffle off 2 copies of Field Notes from an Unintentional Birder, which I'm excited to do. But I want to thank Julia very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Allison. Thank you for inviting me. And I sorry, I'm just looking through the chat. There was one comment about somebody wondering if they could have my email. So I have a website, juliazarankin.com, and feel free to contact me through the contact button on my website.
Kaylee was gonna, that's good, perfect.
And this was such a pleasure. Thanks for all your awesome questions. And this was really so great.
And this is, you are our penultimate reading for this season. We have on June 13th, Daryl McLeod is going to join me, and I'm excited because I see 3 writers who are coming to Junction Reads next year. Frances, Heidi, and Lindsay are there. We kick off our next season with Heidi. So Heidi, thank you so much for coming to this reading. And that is it. So follow us on Twitter, all of our social medias, and go to www.junctionreads.ca to get our upcoming schedule. But before we sign off, 2 copies that Karina has given me of Field Notes from an Unintentional Birder. And Kaylee, are you ready?
I am ready. I've got my little raffle box here. All right, so our first winner for today is Catherine Kohler.
Catherine, are you here?
She's been popping in and out. There's a lot of internet issues for a lot of people today, but we will be sure to get a hold of her. And our second copy goes to Samantha Garner.
Yay, Samantha. I think Samantha also. I just saw her name.
Samantha's still here. Yep.
Okay. That's great. Congratulations, Samantha. If you can send me an email to junctionwrites@gmail.com, I will send your name and address off to Karina at Douglas and McIntyre, and she'll send that out to you. And I'll get in touch with Catherine. I think she was registered through Eventbrite, so that should be doable. Julia, again, thank you so much. Kaylee, thank you so much. Our event coordinator, she has been a godsend through this online world that we've navigated this season. And that's it. Julia, do you want to say anything? Do you want to share anything else?
Oh, thank you so much for coming, everybody. And I hope to see you in the real world soon.
Yes, I know. Now that we've come face to face, I said to my husband David, I said, I feel like I'm going to bump into you now at
You
this.
probably will.
Yes, yeah, and I'll have my dog, so you can just be like,
Awesome.
get the heck out of here. Yeah, thank you again, everybody. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time.
Okay,
Bye.
bye everybody. Take care.